Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 3. This is day 3 of FDG TV 2022. I'm your host, Tommy Thompson, and with me is my wonderful co-host, Anne Sullivan.
Yes, and joining us today again is Hailey, our other co-host.
I was going to say you have. So I feel left out because you've got 3 co-hosts.
I do. Yes, we haven't had Sam join us because he is very loud, and it would just be panting noises in the background, and that would be a little concerning.
A little inappropriate for an academic event, I think, in general.
Sam's a dog. I feel like maybe I should put that in there somewhere. He's a very large golden retriever.
We can't cut that for the gag reel. We're just going to have to keep on pushing forward. But yeah, we've got a great show lined up for you today. We've got more guests. We've got more not more FDG TV. That's what this is. We've got more Best Paper Watch. And yeah, I think you know what it is. It's funny. I think it's like day 3 conference fatigue is setting in, which is hilarious because we're filming this before the conference happens. So TV fatigue too, says our top production team. It's like steady on. Like everyone's still enjoying this by and large.
Yes. It is also the first week of school for me for the fall semester, so I'm feeling. I feel like I've got the empathy fatigue going on for our conference goers without the ocean.
You were a champ yesterday because you came in. We recorded our second episode, and then I think you also had to then go off and teach. Not long after. Again, I think actually just as important to say, because this is all pre-recorded, if you are watching this live on the day, we're not going to be able to react to you here in the video feed. We might react to you over in the chat. So yeah, don't be too disheartened if we're not responding to you because we're coming to you from 2 weeks in the past.
Yes. Also, Tommy is actually ignoring you.
Not on purpose. Like, I'm still an academic. For a little while longer anyway. Anywho, right. Let's get on to this.
Yes, importantly, Biscuit Watch.
Oh, Biscuit Watch. Yes, sorry. I don't have much to report on Biscuit Watch because I've been very well behaved since I got back from Scotland. Do you have anything to report on your end?
Well, I'm in the South, so biscuits are very, very popular here. Generally buttermilk biscuits, often with gravy and chicken.
Not quite the biscuits we're thinking of usually over here, but that's fine.
Yes, cookie wise, it's the first week of class, so Oreos have made an appearance, and of course, Sam gets dog biscuits when he's particularly good.
Do you give Oreos out to your students?
No, those are for me.
Oh, okay. I'm suddenly reminded. I remember we had a whole health and safety thing many years ago because we were reminded not to hand out cookies, biscuits, or any other confectionery to students in case there's a nut allergy risk in the middle of the crowd.
Oh, you just get ones that are like nowadays. They all say whether there's any possibility of allergens. So you just find ones that are, non-allergenic.
Yeah. I think there was also a minor health and safety issue because I used to. So you don't get them in the US. You get this like small bite-sized chocolate bars, very small chocolate bars. They're called Freddos in the UK. And I used to sometimes take a bunch of them with me into a freshman year class because to get them to answer questions. If they answered it right, I'd actually just throw it up to them. And then somebody pointed out, you've got a mean pitching arm.
You might actually hurt someone.
There's about 300 people in the room. So, if I'm trying to aim for the back of the room, it's like, so yeah, we had to stop. Eventually I just started walking up and giving it to them, but I felt like it wasn't as visceral an experience.
No, definitely not.
Anyway.
All right. Yes. Well, we could talk about biscuits forever, obviously.
Join us on Discord when this is finished.
Yes. We do have the rest of the show lined up for you, and we've got some great stuff coming up. So we're going to first be looking at how AI can help create animations, which is pretty exciting, and then how game development practices differ around the world. And then, of course, Mike will be joining us potentially when we see the videos, and we'll be learning more about the best papers.
Alrighty, shall we get straight into it then?
Yes.
He says, 10 minutes into this preamble. But let's do this.
Let's do it.
push over just to myself for a second and do this is the obligatory process we have to go through to make sure that our guests are able to come in and get comfortable before we actually start interviewing them. All right, without further ado, let's welcome in our first guest of the day. This will be Dagmar Loftsdottir. And a obligatory applause for you, which you can't hear, but it's definitely in the mix.
Yay.
I can hear it. I can hear it in my mind, in my heart.
Welcome to the show. So Dagmar is the author of Sketch Between, video-to-video synthesis for sprite animation via sketches. And that was presented earlier today for those of you who are watching. And it was presented in the AI track. So welcome again. Just to give the viewers a quick overview of your paper. This paper introduces a program called Sketch Between, or an algorithm called Sketch Between, which can produce sprite animations if provided a start sprite, an end sprite, and then some sketches, black and white sketches in between, and it will create the whole animation. And so just really quickly, is this your first FDG?
So it's my first time bringing anything to the table, but I was allowed to observe last year when it was virtual.
You were allowed.
Yes, I was there in the background watching.
Well, welcome. I think everybody's going to be excited to hear about your work.
Thank you.
Speaking
I'm happy to share.
Speaking of, we actually have some of the work available for people to see. Let me just jump over to our other screen here. And we actually pulled some of the graphics down just to let this, particularly to let people get an idea of what the work is doing. And so we actually, because these are graphics that you've already published online. And so we then pulled them down so that people can at least have this to visualize while we're actually having a conversation, which I thought would help. So
sure.
Yeah, so about this, actually, could you tell us a little bit about the motivation for this work? Like what drove you to try and conduct this project?
Yes. So I am working in research right now, but kind of growing up, I've always been very into the art world. I've always been drawing online, posting my stuff, and joining these little art communities. So art and animation are very important to me. They're meaningful kind of areas in my life. And I realized in my research, I would love to do and make like the tools that I wish I had. So for this one, for me, when I do animations, the most daunting, time-consuming part is laying down flats and shading between keyframes. So it's really kind of motivated by my own desire to have this. I just want it.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
I feel like that has motivated a lot of my research as well, because I also have a more artistic background, and there's constantly things that I wish existed. So that makes perfect sense. Speaking of the art world, there's a lot of things that have been studied pretty extensively when it comes to movement, like in cinematography and choreography. And have you considered, or do you have any thoughts on how these disciplines can possibly inform this algorithm?
So I have just about zero experience with cinematography and choreography, which is sad because my mom kind of makes movies a little bit, not the best, that I know nothing. But I have done like reading on animation, and I know that animation has taken a lot from these disciplines, especially choreography. So if you look at like the principles of animation in The Illusion of Life, which is like the big Disney animation book, like you'll see that it's clearly inspired by like the fluid ways that people move, like with purpose in all kinds of choreography. Yeah, so that's kind of filtered down, and it's definitely coming from this place of like how we've moved through time. But I'm not very familiar with the exact kind of spaces.
Yeah, it's interesting because I hadn't really considered the fact that the book you mentioned, would draw so much from choreography. But I guess it makes sense because in choreography you're trying to hit certain poses, and it's kind of the keyframes almost of an animation.
Yeah.
Interesting.
There's a little bit more exaggeration with animation, just to like kind of really push the life in it.
Mm-hmm.
But definitely.
So
very cool.
One thing that I thought was really interesting is, we're talking there about influences from likes of cinematography and existing work, and even in the corpus, the training corpus you have for this algorithm, you're relying on existing work, even things like animations of cartoon characters like Disney and the like. So I guess that one of the interesting things here is there a chance that there's an inherent bias that now exists in that corpus because it's going to adhere to these realistic, albeit potentially more extravagant flourishes. So I guess, for example, if you were to create a sketch that has an unrealistic pose, the output of the system would essentially, do you think that it would potentially like normalize it into something that's more conventional based on what we've already seen? Because that's what the input is going into the corpus when you're training it.
So absolutely 100% there's a bias that it's getting from the training corpus. Kind of looking at the outputs, it's really hard for me to try to predict what fails and what succeeds and like what it exactly does in like places where it's getting strange inputs. Because if you look at the fish that's up there, there's nothing like that in the training corpus. My friend Fishy drew that teethy fish on Twitter. When I asked her to draw an animal in motion, and I was extremely surprised by how that turned out. But like something like the chinchilla, which is a lot more similar to what's in the training corpus, does much worse. And that's actually because most of what's in the training corpus is a lot more, has a much higher frame rate. So it's very biased to frame rate and like speed of motion. And it's kind of failing. Like if you look at this cow, it's doing a very small motion in the 5 frames versus the bunny that did like a big hop. So there's definitely a lot of biases. I can't say if it would necessarily shift the pose. I think it would probably just fail to fill it in properly.
That makes sense. So thinking about what is supplied to the algorithm, currently you're looking for the start and the end frame. Do you think there's any room for maybe the end frame to be generated as part of this? So there's basically giving the AI a bit more room to add its own expressiveness almost, and kind of, this is where we want it to start, and then the AI itself generates where it ends.
So I actually did this as part of my paper. I performed an ablation study to kind of see whether the structure was even necessary. And in a lot of cases, it does just fine without the final frame, right? The issue arises if there's occlusions. So if my arm, or if the arm of something is behind the creature and then it comes out at the end, or if there's some kind of rotation, you could let the AI kind of decide what that arm should look like. And it doesn't do completely terribly, but it makes the design kind of ambiguous. Like it takes control away from the user, which when you're making a sprite, you're maybe making, I don't know, you could be making the 4th or 5th sprite for this character, and you don't necessarily want the design to be changing. So that's one reason that the final keyframe is included, but there are certainly cases where it can be left out, and you can just generate based on the first frame alone.
That's very cool. Yeah, I could see. I like the fact that there's you have, as an artist, you have varying control over what how much the AI can do. It's a really nice touch.
Thank you.
I guess on the same note, is there a possibility that the tool could then be used in reverse, like as a mechanism for, like, could you actually introduce any explainability in the algorithm that might be useful to an animator? So, we're talking there particularly about occlusion of limbs and what have you. So it's, the final set of animation frames that it created look like this, and they're designed like this, and they're colored like this, based inherently on, well, this was what I'd learned from reading in from the earlier frames, and this is how I've decided to apply it. I don't know. I wonder if there's something like an interesting tool that could then be used in an explainable AI context for animators. This is a very open question. I'm not even sure I'm completely convinced by my question itself, but
no, I think it's a very interesting question. So there's been a lot of very recent kind of generative art tools, and I'm lucky enough to be friends with a ton of artists, and I do consider myself an artist as well. And what I've noticed kind of in our chats about the tools is that my friends spend a lot of time just kind of doing like almost AI archaeology, like they're trying to figure out what parts of their input are doing what to the output. I think that having a tool that could just tell them would, or like, to the extent that explainable AI can explain to them what's going on, would probably save them a ton of time and like make them feel more comfortable using the tool. Although it also seems like they're having just an absolute blast doing the AI archaeology. So I don't know if it's worth taking that away from them. They're having a good time. Suddenly all my friends are interested in AI, and it's amazing.
Yeah, I've seen that with the AI art communities as well. Like one of the first things that comes up is, these crowdsourced Google Docs that are just full of, here's what the parameters are and what they do, and here are some possibilities. But yeah.
And particularly you're exposing that to a bunch of people who don't understand what those things inherently are. But but you're, like you say, they're, that opportunity to experiment with it to yield different outcomes, and they're not understanding potentially this is how it's changing certain like convolutional layers of the network, or how the search space is being constructed when during development or training or what have you. But ultimately, the ability to go, hey, look, we can tweak with this thing and look at this cool stuff we're getting. I think there is certainly, as someone who's usually on the other end of that, I do think there's something inherently appealing about giving people tools to play with and just seeing what they can infer from it. Because quite often they will start to think to break it in ways I never would have thought of. Because
absolutely.
Basic software engineers over here. That's our problem.
So kind of thinking about how artists use different tools, sketching is something that's often used for concept development, storyboarding, etc. But, do you envision that your approach might work with that sort of thing? And if so, like what requirements would that have? Basically, how do you see your algorithm possibly being used by artists? I guess is the question.
Yeah, that it makes sense as a question. So how would my method apply to those scenarios? I don't think that like this exact approach could be like copy pasted necessarily into another art space. I feel like even just between like storyboarding and animation, which are like parts of the same pipeline, like the experiences and workflows are so different, but you could probably, like, you would have to do so much groundwork to understand like what designers and artists want and like what level of creative input they want, what kind of inputs they like. But you could probably do something similar. I am actually, I think you mentioned concept art.
Concept development, concept art.
Yeah. So I'm actually working on my next project is kind of related. It's like concept character design, and it has a very similar setup, but kind of based on talking to my friends and my own experiences with it, the input is completely different. So you really need to adapt it quite heavily for it to be useful in any way, but I hope maybe someone sees their like branch of art and goes like, oh, maybe something like this would be useful for me.
Yeah, well, I'm sure, given all of the variations on the AI art tools out there, and it seems like that's what people are doing, is really modifying the data sets for their particular need. So, given that, like, where would you, where would you see your research be applied, or do you think or are you interested in it being applied in outside of academia, or are you still refining?
Outside of academia, I haven't even decided what I'm doing for a PhD if I'm doing it, but
fair enough.
I still think that just, as a tool for artists, I don't really care where it's presented to them, if it's like part of the art programs that they already use, or if it's something that, they can go and use kind of separately. But ideally, I would like this to help people make stuff. I wanna help people have co-creative experiences and make the art that they want to make, that they've always wanted to make. So any kind of application like that, I think I would be very happy with.
Excellent.
I mean, I think, like you say, at this stage, you're still figuring out what you want to do for your PhD. Most people haven't figured out the answer to that question at the end of their PhD.
I was going to say, I still don't know what I'm going to do for my PhD, and that was a decade ago. So
still don't really know what the point of it all was.
That's very reassuring.
Anyway, yeah.
Existential crisis aside,
you're in good company, I believe, because you're at the University of Alberta. I think you'll be well taken care of. I don't think you get anything to worry about there. But anyway, what we'll do is we'll let you go for today, and we can continue on our own existential crises without you. But Dagmar, thank you so much for joining us. Yes. As a reminder to everyone, this is Sketch Between, video-to-video synthesis for sprite animation via sketches. And I hope you have a great remainder of the week and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you. I hope I do too. Have a great time with FDG TV.
Thanks.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye. All right. Wonderful. Thank you very much to Dagmar joining us. That was really interesting body of work. Also, this is, I think it was as pointed out, this is actually part of Dagmar's master's project. So very early phase in research, but at the same time, some really exciting stuff coming in, and I'm feeling a little bit jealous. How are you feeling there, Anne?
I'm feeling a little ashamed of my own master's project.
My master's project, I did get it published at a conference. I don't think it was as cool as that, though.
No.
To be fair,
I saw it and it wasn't. I'm kidding.
To be fair, I do actually. I think in many sectors of my life now, you're seeing the new generations come in and go, "Oh my God, they're stupidly talented. We are doomed. We're going to be working for these people in no time." Anyway,
good.
Speaking of
put them in charge.
Speaking of feeling doomed as you watch other more talented people, let's jump over. We've got another episode of Best Paper Watch for you. Mike is once again continuing his journey across the UK, trying to find more of the best papers for you to enjoy. This time, he's actually in Wimbledon Common, which, for Anne, that's in London.
Yes, thank you. I did need to know that.
Home of the Wombles, for all of our British friends out there who are looking for a particular little Easter egg for you. But apparently he's chasing swans and looking at how technology affects art and vice versa.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Best Paper Watch. I'm continuing my journey to FDG. This time we've worked our way up to London. I'm in Wimbledon Common today on this rather cloudy but crisp day, and we're going to be working our way through the Common today, drawing some pictures and creating some art while we talk about a couple more best papers. Now you might notice today I don't have any easels on me, I don't have any paints or pastels, but I do have my tablet with me and my stylus, and that's because today is all about the impact of the digital on the creation of best papers. And our first best paper encapsulates that perfectly. It's the effects of human-like modification to heuristic action evaluation in video game pathfinding. Now, this best paper, like a lot of great artworks over the years, is striving to capture something of the human, something lifelike in this artificial creation. And in particular, they're looking at how AI characters traverse game worlds, so how they pathfind, how they get from A to B, and how we can make that happen in a more human-like way. So if you've ever played a game or watched an AI play a game at a very high level, you'll notice that the way that an AI plays a video game is very different to how a human would. And the authors/artists here were really interested in taking that and trying to fix it in some way, trying to change it, trying to create an agent that would play the game in a way that humans could not just understand and not just believe is human-like, but also a way that humans could replicate, a way that humans could learn from and copy. And the way they've done this is they've taken a very popular pathfinding algorithm called A* search, and they've modified it in such a way that the actions that the AI is allowed to do are restricted. So for example, instead of being able to press a different button every frame and do loads of frame-perfect tricks, they add constraints which discourage the AI from making too many snap decisions and changes to the way that it moves. And you can see here from some of the illustrations that I've pulled from the paper, the black lines are what a normal pathfinding algorithm would do. That's how an AI would normally play a game like this. But the blue lines here show the path of their agent, the agent created by the artists/authors. We can see here that this line is much smoother, it doesn't take as many risks. All in all, it looks like something that you or I might do if we were playing this game. Well, I think I've perfectly captured the essence of the ducks that are waddling through this pond here, and maybe not quite as lifelike as the AI agents in our first best paper, but good enough for today. Let's go a little bit deeper into the common in search of our next best paper. Our next best paper today performs an archaeological study inside the video game Elden Ring, and in doing so it finds not just facts about the history and culture of Elden Ring's player base, but it also has a sort of meta-reflection on what it means to conduct an archaeological survey inside a video game, and particularly one in which the information is changing and decaying all the time. Our next best paper is The Dark Souls of Archaeology, Recording Elden Ring. Now in this study, the authors find a bunch of messages in Elden Ring, both intentionally left and unintentionally left. The intentional ones are messages that have been written by players, shared throughout the game world for other players to find. And these messages can be jokes, they can be warnings, they can be pranks or advice. The authors catalogue the messages they find, where they find them, and try and give reasons for why messages might have been left where they were. At the same time, they're also interested in the messages that have been left unintentionally. So in Elden Ring, when you die, you leave behind a ghost that shows the last few seconds of everything that you did before you passed away. And the authors used this not just to intuit what players were doing in these spaces, but even to figure out where they had been previously and where they were going next, judging by the clothes they were wearing or the weapons they were using. Now, while Elden Ring's system of in-game messages might seem a little far-fetched and unrealistic, actually, people leave messages for each other all the time, even in the real world, with the hope of them persisting for decades or centuries. And a lot of the activity that we do in games like Dark Souls or Elden Ring or online worlds and MMOs, we can only hope for them to persist for maybe a few years, a decade if we're lucky, before they get lost to time. And even in this age of Let's Plays and Twitch, there's still not a lot of real study being done to record the culture of these spaces permanently. And so I like this work as maybe an indicator of how we can do that in the future. And it also provides an insight into the kind of challenges that we might face as archaeologists diving into these ephemeral spaces where data, code, and technology decays at even a faster rate than many ruins. Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for this episode of Best Paper Watch, but don't worry, we've got another episode coming tomorrow. We're not finished quite yet. There'll be 2 more great best papers to share with you there, as well as the final leg of our journey. Until then, it's back to the FDG TV studio, and I hope you enjoy another day at the conference. Bye.
Thanks again, Mike, for another wonderful episode of Best Paper Watch. Strangely excited about that Elden Ring paper, but also I'm probably not going to play it for another 5 years, so I'm hoping that it ages like a fine wine. In the meantime, we've got our next guests with us. Please give a warm welcome to Robin Sloan and Hailey Austin, both from Abertay University. And They're listed on this paper that we're going to be talking about, by and large. Transnational Development Cultures, Navigating Production, Market and Cultural Difference Within European Chinese Game Development Teams. This paper was presented yesterday in the Games and Humanities track, and it also had an honourable mention. So welcome to you both.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So yeah, just to kind of give a bit of a high-level summary for people who haven't checked out this paper yet, that you presented a case study on transnational game development with students at Abertay University, where you were working with students across both. You actually had a mixture of European and also Chinese students, but also you were really interested in producing game prototypes for the UK and China markets. And I guess to kind of ease people into this, could you maybe highlight to us what are the big challenges or even differences when it comes to game design production, or even like actual release between the likes of, say, European markets in the UK compared to the likes of China?
Yeah, it's a massive difference in many areas. Research is part of a bigger project specifically about this because it's been identified kind of by UK industry. The growth of the market in China, I think it is now overtaking the US as the biggest games market in terms of revenue. And yet it's kind of an unknown for those that are overseas because the complexities in accessing it, which is kind of the impetus for why you want to do something. That's obviously economic and business interests in there, which is one thing, but also the cultural interests, because cross-cultural collaboration is really interesting, I think, particularly to us, Hailey himself. And we're universities, we have lots of international students. This is exactly the kind of thing that we like to do, is bring people together and see what kind of things they create. So in terms of this paper, we were looking at, looking at that twofold as the kind of simple version. We're looking at both how people work together, where do they bring from their own cultural backgrounds, and how does that help lead to new ideas, new creativity, or again, things like challenges, friction, what kind of arises out of that. That's really interesting to us. But also the more market side, how do you understand each marketplace, if you like? And we're really kind of a two-way project, although we're looking after the UK end of our project. We are interested in about how UK, European, or wider Western companies engage with China to get their products and services out to market there, but also the way around. There's lots of collaborators in China that are just as curious about how do I get my game into the UK, into Europe. I have no idea how to do that. So really it is like an open-ended exploratory project along those lines. And yeah, the case study was an opportunity for us to kind of test that out, see what students come up with, both see how they work together. First of all, that was the main thing. That's always it's always interesting to do that with students. And these are postgraduate students, so a bit more advanced, but there's always challenges that come up with that, right? But then also seeing how they think through some of the problems of how do you adapt a game product to China, or vice versa? How do you resolve localized, culturalized differences that have different meanings? Even what are those? Because there's a lot of unknowns here.
Right. So, given that, do you have like an example of a game that best captures the Chinese market demands? And I just want to give Hailey a chance to chat if she would like as well.
Yeah. One of the biggest games in China right now is called Genshin Impact.
Yeah.
And it really highlights kind of what is big in China right now, but also the boundaries that they're pushing in a lot of different ways. It's this big open world game, but a big thing about it is that it is cross-platform. So you can start at home on your PC, and then, when you're traveling into work, you just pick up your phone and you pick up right where you left off. And it's this big game. In the Western market, this would be a console-only kind of game. But we're seeing this move in China to what they're calling mobile AAA. So taking these, what we consider to be these huge, console-only games, and making them for the phone, for phone first, or to be compatible between both the PC and the mobile gamers. So that is really setting a really high trend, I think, globally. So not only in the China market, but I think globally it is really setting, a trend making waves in lots of different ways that we haven't necessarily seen before, which is really cool.
Right.
Yeah, like Hailey, I wondered on that note, like one of the things I think Robin actually kind of spoke to this as well, that we're talking about differences between these two markets and also some of the way in which people engage with games. What do you feel is bigger? Because we've got the legal policy differences, which we're aware of this, and certainly there's, as you say, trying to get a game into the Chinese market, and indeed, like a European game in the Chinese market and vice versa. But you also speak to a cultural difference of platforms, where particularly I think China sits alongside South Korea as that's a country where mobile gaming is much, much larger and more prevalent, arguably, than console and PC gaming. Which do you think is the bigger of the two challenges, I guess, to overcome?
Personally, I would say policy, because it's policies that banned kind of consoles and console gaming that have led to this huge kind of mobile market. And yeah, I think a big barriers are trying to figure out, and what the project Robin and I are on is trying to figure out what are these barriers. And a lot of it, what we have looked at is policy, and both the written rules and the unwritten rules, which are a lot harder to find out.
I would imagine.
So that is my opinion from the research that I've seen. That is not to say that there are not cultural differences, but it seems to be that a lot of the kind of production values and methods are similar across both, and it's much more the market and the policy that I think is different.
Mm-hmm. So actually, just a quick follow-up question. Is there differences in the technology as well? Like, I know there used to be a lot of differences in mobile phone capabilities, but I haven't followed it for a while, so I'm not sure if that has caught up where, the West has gotten more advanced phone technology. So has that caught up, or is there still differences there as well?
There are still some differences. You see kind of more Chinese phone companies that will make gaming specific phones. You don't see that as much over here.
Not yet.
Exactly, not yet. But so I'd say we are catching up, but they still have an upper hand in some of that technology.
Right. So in your research study, you did some development with the same team where they worked on 2 games together. Throughout that process, did you notice that the team dynamics and the design development practices might have changed over time, just given as they got more comfortable with working with each other and learning each other's culture and technical differences?
Yeah, we definitely saw that improved. I think I think we probably came into it with a degree of caution, thinking it's going to be challenging because there's all, and that particular team worked remotely. So 4 of the teams in the study were co-located in the same studio in Scotland. So it was cross-cultural, but done the old-fashioned way in the same studio, right? But our second one was focused more on remote, and that was quite challenging because we had people based in Europe, people based in China. And I think I certainly went into that thinking this is going to be challenging for a number of reasons. Okay, before I even got to the kind of cultural differences, I was worried about time difference because I've done remote working with time difference before, and that was a killer. And this was about as extreme as a time difference could get. But also there was other issues around internet access and blocking and basically the firewall in China and what could be passed. I find that really interesting as a developer. I wonder how things like source control work and how data sharing works in these situations. So that was quite a nice risk to look at. And then I got to thinking about, well, what kind of cultural differences and language barriers are going to be here. Now, to my surprise, they worked really well together pretty quickly. The opening few weeks, there was a lot of kind of faux pas and I guess to an extent, I think kind of misunderstandings and miscommunications that, if I'm honest, I don't think were purely to do with cultural difference. I see it in the games industry all the time. And it's just that's the kind of thing that happens, and you learn to work together and teams go through a storming phase and they kind of get there. I think by the time they had got to the second project, they were working really, really well together. In the paper, I kind of commented that they were using kind of the kind of standard production tools, the communication tools that we would expect any team to use today. More the sort of Discord rather than Slack, Jira for project management. I think all that's going to by the by. We know that teams did that, but that seemed to work really well. The thing that I felt they really highlighted when you spoke to us was the social side, which I think is the big thing. And I've certainly noticed this in remote working, and I'm curious about this all the time about game studios, who are by and large, a lot of studios are now remote, or they have remote policies, or they have staff that are almost entirely remote and never come into an office. Is that you lose something on the social side that is so important to being a team. So that, on top of the cultural and language differences, I felt the team did really well by the time they got to the second project. As Hailey intimated there, the cultural differences weren't as large or weren't as unsurmountable as we might presume they would be. And actually, a lot of the things that came up were kind of more your run-of-the-mill production problems.
Interesting.
I mean, I think actually to help frame viewers' perception of this, I thought, how much did the current state of, or we're now in a phase where like COVID lockdowns are beginning to be relaxed. How much did that have much of an impact on the first half of that project as well? Because also, speaking for my own self, I'm a Scotsman based in England, but the UK has different COVID policies in each of the devolved nations, so things have been quite hard to follow, I think, to say the least.
It is challenging, isn't it? I mean, the bigger picture is obviously this study took place within our wider project. Our wider project was entirely, or is entirely, about UK-China collaboration. It's a really hard thing to do. I think a lot of people who've done business in China know that the best way to do that is to be in China and to forge relationships in person. It's a big cultural aspect of working in China. COVID hit about 4 weeks after our project started. Oh, wow. And therefore we never visited China. We were meant to have been out to China to work with our partners in person 4 or 5 times by now. So that instantly hit our collaboration. It was very difficult to do that. In terms of this specific project, the first 4 teams were taking part in the project in the UK when we'd come out of a lockdown. I can't remember which phase we were at, but we were now back in person. As an educator, we'd already been through that horrible phase where in Scotland the rules were such that we had classrooms that could normally hold 80, that we had 10 people in, and we were all kind of shouting at each other. We thought, well, we may as well be on Teams. I can see you over there with your mask on. That's great. Hello, how are you? These teams were taking part when we were allowed to sit more close together, and we were able to get teams actually behaving like teams. Yeah, it's not just about being in the same place; it's about being able to actually socially interact in a meaningful human way, right? So the 4 teams were there. The second team were always fully remote. That was in part because some of those students were remote students, the master's students. So we do online delivery as well as in-person delivery.
Right. So you mentioned that the cultural differences ended up not being as much of an issue as you thought, but was there some knowledge sharing that you thought did overcome some of the barriers and challenges that you faced? And maybe Hailey, you can start with this one.
Yeah, I think so. I think we learned that I think one of the big takeaways was that the students come together and work together in very similar ways in both places, and that a lot of the cultural differences are similar to just kind of personal differences that you can find anywhere, whether that's myself as an American living in Scotland, or as the Chinese students living here. It could be all kinds of different differences, but the teams that came together and really listened to each other and learned from each other were the ones that tended to succeed and get along more, I would say. So we did learn that I think there's a bigger idea that cultural difference and language difference makes a huge difference. And while it does, it's still just part of being in a team and the challenges that come with that, whether it's in person or remote.
Right. Robin, did you find anything that
on Yeah, on the cultural side, I think certainly on the collaboration as a team, it was quite smooth. I think one of the things I found, and I think probably it's got of relevance to industry more widely, is the degree to which the knowledge sharing was such a major part in understanding what would work. Now, a lot of the games industry is very driven by data and analytics and trying to know the answer before you've asked the question. And we know more often not that the big successes in games are kind of hard to predict. We don't know where they come from. And I suspect from a lot of the games companies I've spoken to in the UK about the China market, that they are generally interested in what would sell, what's the right thing to do, how do I do X, Y, and Z, and what would be allowed, what wouldn't be allowed, that kind of thing. And I think one of the things I learned from working with these teams is the degree to which the developers are really good at leaning on each other's cultural knowledge and insights. And that's the thing, again, we see developers do all the time. You have gut instincts about what works. But there was a lot of, I guess, sharing of, anxieties and some of maybe the British developers thinking, oh, we've based our game in the UK. Nobody will get this outside the UK. They won't understand it. And then having some of the Chinese developers come in and say, "Oh, no, this would be great. There's huge interest in that. My mum would love this," type thing. And those kind of interactions, which I think, if we weren't doing this kind of cultural exchange and bringing different backgrounds, different nationalities together to explore these ideas, then there might have been a hesitancy, or there might have been design decisions made, or like omissions or edits made, or there might have been too much reading of the market reports, which do tend to give too big a picture of here's what sells, therefore we'll do that. Well, that doesn't always add up. So I found that really interesting. Actually, probably the kind of dates that we went through, I suspect most of it was around that. It was more about the kind of cultural insights and contributions, and it was two-way. Although we were really largely focused on our end on trying to help the European-based, the UK-based developers understand the access to the China market and those demographics. It was a two-way relationship. It was Chinese developers also understanding more about the British market and British tastes, and that wouldn't really have happened if they weren't in a team together trying to solve problems.
Well, yeah, I think it was a really interesting paper. I really enjoyed reading it, and I think there's quite a lot that people can still pull from this. If you haven't seen the presentation already, and if you haven't, or actually if you just listened to this conversation and you found it quite enjoyable, so just as a reminder for everyone, this is Transnational Development Cultures Navigating Production, Market and Cultural Difference within European Chinese Game Development Teams. Robin, Hailey, thank you both very much for joining us today. And I hope you have a great time at the rest of the conference, which is yet to happen, but you're going to enjoy it nonetheless.
Thank you.
We will. That's us told.
That's it. You're told.
Yes.
That's it. You're told. I'm going to have to explain that to everybody else. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See, I was really worried that my accent was going to start changing, because as soon as you've got people who either live in Scotland or are Scottish on the call, then I expect my voice is going to go. So I think we managed to survive that by and large. I think that worked out great. But speaking of making sure I get to retain my Scottish accent, I'm not really allowed to do that around you, Anne, because you just get confused and don't understand what I'm saying. So
What was that? I'm kidding. That was a really bad joke.
No.
Anyway, given that last paper, what I have learned, by the way, is that we need to make a game about the Wombles.
Yes. I think the Wombles might be difficult to break out of British culture, because it's also such a dated thing. I don't know if they ever rebooted the Wombles.
Why not now?
Well, you never know. I did find that quite interesting, though, particularly, having made games myself, and how easy it is to, once you get a game into certain markets, it's okay, cool, now we can push for here, here, and here. But particularly certain countries, we have no, certainly from my perspective, I had no real grasp of like, okay, could we launch that there? How do we launch that there? What are the issues you would have to face? And a lot of it is policy as well, because certain rules and regulations on games or different media as they come out in different countries, I think is an interesting challenge, which as a single indie developer isn't worth the time. But particularly now, because I work more with other studios, I think it's an interesting thing to be learning more and more about. But yeah, we'll get Mike on it, see if we can get the IP for the Wombles.
Okay, perfect. Next year's Best Paper Watch, the Wombles.
We'll just have everybody in Womble costumes. playing the music and everything.
Perfect.
All right. So I think this is the end of our episode for today. So tomorrow is the last day of FDG, right?
Yes.
What's coming
Yes.
up, Anne?
Well, we have the late breaking work session, the reflection session, then a workshop organized by Microsoft, who, as you may recall, is the sponsor of FDG this year, and then a games and the metaverse workshop. So a number of exciting sessions and workshops to attend.
Plus, tomorrow at FDG TV, we're going to be bringing some sparkles to the conference. Carly Korsherick is going to be talking about games for girls, particularly games dated back to the 90s, which I remember actually quite a lot of these, and so I'm quite interested to hear more about this. And also we're going to have Pejman Mirzababaye come in to talk about AI playtesting. Mike is going to be out for another episode of Best Paper Watch. He's going to be out in the big smoke. He's going to be in the centre of London itself with the very last chapter. And we've also got, of course, our audience participation challenge.
Yes.
Anne, what is it we're doing here?
Yes, just keep your eyes on the Discord for information about what to submit, and we will be showing your pictures.
All right. Well, with that, that's the end of this episode. So I want to give a quick moment just to say thank you to our guests, to Dagmar, to Hailey, to Robin. A big thank you to Anne as being my wonderful co-host, to Mike.
And thank you to Kaylee.
And to Kaylee, of course, got to remember. Thank you to Mike for going out and doing the hard work on Best Paper Watch. To Antonius for shouting at us in the production feed the whole time that we do this. And, of course, a big thank you to all of you for tuning in and supporting this nonsense.
And thank you to Tommy. This side.
I thought we were going to high five, but...
Oh, yeah.
Right.
No, wrong hand.
Ah, perfect.